as the panelists get settled, I'm going to begin. Good morning, everyone. Welcome again to the conference. My name is Mariya Ilyas. I'm a second-year MALD student here at Fletcher, focusing on international security and global maritime affairs. And I'm also in Professor Miller and Professor Isteman's U.S.-Russia Relations course. I'll be moderating this panel titled Instability in the Middle East and the Threat of Radical Jihadism. The threat of non-state actors like ISIS, the development of radical ideologies, and the ongoing crises, not just in Syria, but also in Yemen and Libya, continue to make the Middle East a hot topic for the international fora. So while the threat of terrorism and defeating ISIS present opportunities for cooperation for both the United States and Russia, defining the enemy remains an important challenge. Therefore, in this panel, we'll try to answer the following questions. What are the stumbling blocks for the Russian-American compromise on Syria? What are the differences between the parties in defining the threat of radical jihadism? And to what extent do Russian and American perspectives differ on the Iranian nuclear deal, Turkish policies, and the Yemeni and Libyan conflicts? Before we begin, as you've been reminded throughout the conference this morning, if you'd like to pose a question, please feel free to do so with the Pigeonhole platform we have online. You can put them through our website or through our mobile app. So we have 4 great panelists this morning with us. And in order to facilitate a discussion amongst all of them, I'll ask them to keep their remarks to 5 to 7 minutes. Let us begin with our first panelist, Dr. Irina Zvyagelskaya. She was a research fellow at the Institute of Oriental Studies at the Russian Academy of Sciences and a professor in the development of Oriental Studies at MGIMO University. Her areas of expertise include contemporary history, conflicts, as well as international relations and security in the Middle East and Central Asia. Dr. Zvyagelskaya, what are some of your thoughts on some of the questions?
Thank you. And thank you very much for hosting all of us here. It's a great pleasure, and probably we shall host you later in Moscow. So I believe that the topic of this conference is really of greatest importance. And as far as the Middle East is concerned, it's probably one of the few places now where Russia and the United States do cooperate on certain issues. I would not over-exaggerate this cooperation, but still we should recognize that as far as Syria is concerned, for example, we both have military presence in this country. So there, on the one hand, we have deconflicting between the military, which started long ago from 2015. At the same time, we also have our cooperation in certain political formats. First of all, Geneva, of course, which is a very important tool of promoting political settlement in Syria. And also we have Astana format, which Russia perceives as a sort of complementary to Geneva. The United States perceive Astana a little bit different, but still there is a representative of the United States at Astana meetings, and we do understand that without stabilization on the ground, without ceasefire on the ground, there will be no political negotiations in Geneva. So these two formats, they, of course, are linked to each other. But this said, I would continue with saying that we still have a lot of differences in the Middle East. Despite the fact that we have a common enemy there, like ISIS, like other jihadist organizations, terrorist organizations, we can now say that as far as ISIS is concerned, it was militarily defeated in Syria. Now it controls only from 5 to 7% of the territory. And of course, it doesn't mean that its core fighters, they all were defeated. No, they just managed to escape. You know that the frontiers are very porous. You know that then they can use the area of tribes where they also can be unseen for some time, and then they can erupt in other areas. So it's not as simple as that. And of course, ideology is also in place. But still, we can say that now there were successes, military successes, of both coalitions. And what we have now, we have government forces in the West and opposition forces in the east, which are supported by the United States. And thanks to the taking of Aleppo, Homs, and Raqqa, these two coalitions are getting closer and closer. Whether it's a good sign, I cannot say, because here we really need deconflicting policy to be sure that there will be no accidents, which are possible when two military coalitions are coming closer to each other and when they simultaneously sometimes come to same places, to same targets. The second contradiction, which I believe is probably even more important, it is about the future of Syria. As you know, Russia supported the regime of Assad, not for the sake of Assad, but because it was believed in Russia that we should preserve statehood in Syria. To preserve statehood in Syria meant to preserve what institutions were still left. And of course, there were just two main institutions. It was the Institute of the Presidency and the army. But the army was in shambles in 1915, and really it was revived with Russian support. But now, as you know, it's fighting quite successfully. As far as the Americans are concerned, they supported, from the very beginning, they supported the opposition. And actually, the coalition, which was coined up in 2014 by the United States and Brussels, the aim of these coalitions was double. First, to fight ISIS, and then to fight the Assad regime, because the idea was to support the efforts of the coalition, of the opposition, I'm sorry. So here we really differ in our approaches. And Russia believes that the United States has always been a revisionist force in the Middle East, while Russia remains a sort of conservative force which wants to stabilize the situation on the old I would say, regimes, on the certain old coalitions, not to allow the Middle East to go into pieces, which is quite possible because we have very fragile states now there. So here we really differ. We really differ because while there is no precondition, as it has already been said, that Assad should go just immediately, and there is Resolution 2254, which is a sort of roadmap, because it includes the idea of transitional period, of new constitution, of elections, and so on and so forth. Still, I'm not sure that the opposition in Syria, which has been weakened after all these military victories of the Assad regime, that it really believes that its position will be taken into consideration during the negotiations. And I believe that the opposition in Syria, fragmented as it is, they are still very reluctant as far as negotiations are concerned. They still have a lot of limitations. And since they are supported by the United States, I believe they wanted to get advantage of the American support. And this is one more very serious problem we both face in Syria. Both sides of the Syrian conflict want to take advantage of the American coalition and of the Russian coalition, and we can get involved into the politics of Syrian civil war. And this is really the worst outcome. I hope it will never happen, but we should take it into consideration when we are talking about the situation on the ground. Then we also have very serious differences on Iran and Hezbollah. Hezbollah is perceived in the States as an arm of Iran. It's not exactly so, but of course we do know about these close connections of Hezbollah and Iran. In Russia, we believe that Iran, being a Middle East power, also has its legitimate interests in the area. They should not be denied. But it doesn't mean that Russia supports everything Iran is doing and is very happy about Iran staying in Syria forever or something like this. Of course, we wouldn't like it. But at the same time, we don't believe that Iran should go, as sometimes is articulated in the United States. Because if it should go, why not start with Iraq? And actually, how come that Iran has become so much stronger in Iraq? It happened only after Saddam Hussein was toppled by the United States coalition. We all know it. So it's so very difficult to say how we can minimize the efforts which Iran is doing, both in Syria and Iraq, and what we can do about its policy in the Middle East. I believe we can find a common ground, but probably not now. Right now, it seems we cannot find it really. We should also take into consideration the fact that since there is no bipolar world any longer, regional powers are getting more and more important. And they have been overplaying both the United States and Russia because they have interests of their own, and these interests do not correspond either with the interests of the United States or of Russia. You take Turkey, for example, you take Israel, for example. Despite the fact that we have good relations with all of them, still we do understand that we do not have a lot in common. When I say we now, I mean both Russia and the United States, in common with Saudi policy, say, vis-a-vis Yemen, or with Israeli policy vis-a-vis Hezbollah in Syria, because it can make the situation even more unstable than it is right now. So we have these differences. This said, I believe we still have a chance of finding common ground on the Middle East issues. Just because the Middle East is not a priority, either for Russia or for the United States. When it is not a priority, it's easier to find a compromise. And against very bad, the bad background we have on other issues, especially if you take Ukraine, we should find a certain place, a certain region, where we can improve our relationship. And I believe that our efforts to stabilize the situation in Syria, despite all the differences, might be a way out of our present situation, which some people even label as a new Cold War. Thank you.
Thank you. I'd now like to invite Dr. Monica Toft for her remarks on the topic. She is a professor of international politics at the Fletcher School. In addition to teaching at Fletcher, Dr. Toft is a research associate at the University of Oxford and at the Harvard Kennedy School's Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs. Her areas of research include international security, ethnic and religious violence, civil wars, and demography. Professor Toft, thank you for being here.
Thank you, and thank you for having me. And thank you for your comments. So I have sort of three broad points, and following off, I'm going to go from broader to more narrow. And I think one of the chief issues that we're facing in this U.S.-Russian relations in the current era is that we're moving back to a zero-sum game, and I find that very unnerving. I was part of a group in my early days of graduate school where we were trying to do the reset under the Obama administration. And I was brought in as to be a sort of a post-Cold War person, and I said, actually, I was a Cold Warrior. I was in the U.S. Army as a Russian linguist. And sadly, I feel as if I'm becoming fashionable again with the way relations are going. So study your Russian. And it's not just from the Russian side, it's also from the American side. And so when we come to the Middle East, I do get a sense that, yes, there are points of agreement, but they're slim and they're very narrow. And so I agree that we would like a ceasefire, but beyond that, the agreement sort of dissipates. The U.S. seems to be moving a little closer to the idea that Assad might stay, but only as part of the negotiations to get the ceasefire, whereas Russia seems committed to perhaps allowing him to stay. So my sense of looking at it in the broadest sense is that Russia's sense of influence and power is zero-sum, with the US also similarly, with the idea that ceasing to promote democracy would somehow be a betrayal to US national identity and US foreign policy, and more viscerally, a loss to US power and prestige. Secondarily, the Russian Federation, looking at from the outside in, seems to give priority to hurting the West, and in particular the United States, and it's done it brilliantly, sort of being a stick in the side. And I would contend that some of the timing of the evidence for Russian Federation interventions might be explained by wag the dog, and I'd like to sort of explore that through this panel. So relieving domestic pressure by stoking patriotism at home. Over consideration, I think, of some of Russia's longer term, I'm a student of foreign Islamic jihadist struggles, which I think Russia, given its fight now in Syria, is going to face, with returning fighters, it's going to face some serious issues with that radical jihadist threat. And so it sees itself, paradoxically, Russia does, as less vulnerable to the Sunni terrorism than the West. And I think in part, it may end up actually being more threatened. The United States, as John Mearsheimer says, we have the luxury of being surrounded by two moats, whereas Russia, they can make themselves back. And then also the relationship with Shia Islam, the sort of tight-knit relationship with Iran and Shia Islam as well, it sort of might inflame that. Now, with regards to the Middle East, the Russian Federation, to its credit, has established itself as a serious counterweight to the US and to US interests. There's no denying it. In particular on Iran, its perspective seems to be sort of to hurt the US in some ways. And the US, is not to blame here, that it has the perfect storm, that we have not gotten over the hostage crisis. I call it hostage crisis-itis. And paradoxically, we are a country that tends to forget our history, but some of it we don't. We also have continue to have a strong alliance with Israel, but also a deep reflective anti-authoritarian strain. And we've proven unable, even given large opportunities after 9/11, to seek a realignment with Iran, one of the few states that is stable in the Middle East at this point, and to treat it as a normal state in the international system. So there, I think actually the Russian Federation might be doing a little bit better. On Turkey, the US has few options. It seems to be going down the authoritarian path, whereas Russia and also the PRC does not have the People's Republic of China doesn't have a problem dealing with dictators. And so the United States is limited in its dealings there. So Erdogan, Russia is able to offer it sort of a bomb till it's, I think, wounded pride that is not a member of the EU and is unlikely to be, especially more recently. On Yemen, again, looking at it, there seems to be sort of one alliance against another, the Russian, Iranian, Shia against the Sunni, Saudi, American. And US sees Yemen as a no-win fight, and we're now coming into a catastrophe there, humanitarian catastrophes. So again, the US, we tend to like to find good guys, and unfortunately in many of these places there are no good guys. Which leads us to Libya, and the Russian Federation has systematically sought support to support strongmen, and in this case, former military Lieutenant Haftar under Gaddafi, and while the US and its allies are trying to find some sort of coalition government. So there's differences of agreement about what to do in Libya as well. So to sort of wrap up my comments, the situation is increasingly unsettled and complex. I think in some ways I do miss the end of the Cold War. The 1990s were a gift, and the post-2000s period has been difficult, especially after 9/11 and then since. The United States has struggled to identify good guys it can support. We'd like to do that in pursuit of the twin pillars of longstanding US foreign policy, which is democratization, also weapons nonproliferation, and free trade. The Russian Federation, to its credit, has correctly identified US interests. It's mapped US policy initiatives or lack of initiative, and sought at almost every turn to thwart those interests, even at the expense, I think, in some case, of its own national interests. And here, this panel, we're supposed to talk about the global Islamist jihad. And I think that that's one place where perhaps the US and the Russians can coalesce especially now that ISIS seems to be on the brink of defeat. I don't want to say it's completely defeated. So I'm going to end it there. So I do think there's some points, but I don't think we're there yet to align them.
Thank you. Thank you so much for your insights, Professor. We now turn to our third speaker, Dr. Tamara Cofman Wittes, who is a senior fellow at the Center of Middle East Policy at the Brookings Institution. Dr. Cofman Wittes served as the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Near Eastern Affairs from 2009 to 2012, coordinating U.S. policy on democracy and human rights in the Middle East during the Arab uprisings. On a personal note, as the leader of the Women International Security Group at Fletcher in New England, I'm personally pleased to learn that Dr. Cofman Wittes is a member of the Weiss Global Network. So the floor is yours.
And became one as a graduate student, something I advise all of you to do.
Come to our events, shameless plug. Floor is yours.
Thank you. I'm glad to know that Weiss is thriving on the Fletcher campus. So thanks for the invitation. It's great to be here. It's great to hear from you, Dr. Irina and Monica. Monica did a sort of tour of the region, and I'm going to, I think, take it up to a little bit higher altitude in terms of the American approach to regional order in the Middle East and what the implications are there for Syria and for the potential for US-Russian cooperation. So let me start from what I think is an uncontroversial statement, should be an uncontroversial statement, that stability in the Middle East is a global public good. And we have seen the consequences in recent years for Europe, for other parts of the world when that stability breaks down. The United States was a happy guarantor of regional stability in the Middle East for many decades, working with a coalition of local partners to protect a status quo that advanced those local partners' interests, advanced American interests, and provided that global public good. But that regional order broke down beginning in 2011. And I think it's important to begin with the understanding that the regional order broke down not because of external interventions or even external shocks, but because of drivers from within the region. Demographic, economic, and political shifts that were building over a long period of time. And it broke down ultimately because of the way that most regional governments responded to those pressures in a pretty unconstructive fashion. So it's important to remember as we look ahead that the drivers of the fragility that you were talking about, Irina, are internal. And if we want to address the threat posed to the world by Middle Eastern states' fragility, we have to keep that in mind. Now, today, the disorder of the Middle East has produced not just horrific humanitarian crises, mass refugee flows, and the rise of extremist influence and violence. It has also produced a very fierce geopolitical competition for influence. And there's a lot of opportunistic behavior by regional actors seeking greater influence, seeking to fend off the opportunistic actions of others. And I see opportunistic behavior from outside the region as well. We talk about this usually in the Western media in the context of a Sunni-Shia conflict, but I really think it's more accurate to think about it as good old geopolitics. And frankly, I would put some of Russia's behavior in the Middle East in the last 6 years in that opportunistic category as well. The regional disorder, the throwing of the cards up into the air has created openings in all kinds of ways and places for different actors, and many are seeking to exploit that. Now, I don't see from any of the actors engaged in this opportunistic behavior a real vision for how to reestablish stable, secure order in the region. And I certainly don't see anyone aspiring to provide that global public good in place of the United States. So I think we need to recognize, too, the limits of this behavior and what it can achieve. Now, to be honest, I am not entirely confident that the current American administration has a vision for how to reestablish a stable and secure order in the Middle East. I'm not sure that we see a readiness on their part to make the investments that would be necessary to do that, but even if they did, they would have to confront the divergent views within the region and from other influential actors like Russia of the nature of the problem and how to solve it. What we do see from the current American administration is a readiness to pay a price. Let's remember that President Trump significantly escalated the American troop presence in the Middle East and the rules of engagement in order to push harder to defeat ISIS in Iraq and Syria. So a readiness to pay a price to address major threats emanating from the disordered Middle East, primarily terrorism, not only ISIS, but also state-sponsored terrorism, weapons proliferation, including weapons of mass destruction, and to deter additional conflict. And that last piece is, of course, the most challenging and the most uncertain. Now, perhaps it's possible for the United States and Russia to find common ground, at least in pushing back on these kinds of common threats, even if we can't agree on a vision for the future of the region. But even that cooperation needs to be rooted in a proper understanding of the roots of disorder and violence. And so what I'd emphasize is the necessity of grappling with that reality. We need to accept, all of us need to accept, that the old models for stability in this region were not functioning very well before 2011 and are not functioning now and will not survive. Russia has invested a good deal of treasure and a decent bit of blood to sustain Bashar al-Assad and his regime and Iran's position in Syria. And the declared theory of the case there is the one that you mentioned about preserving the state and the institutions of the state, and the idea that without that, what you have left is terrorism. Okay? But the Assad government does not, did not before 2011 to a certain degree, does not now, and I don't think ever will again, exercise effective control over all of Syria. He didn't have full control over the East before the uprising, and he certainly doesn't have full control over the East now. And as far as the idea of preserving the state and its institutions, when I think about what took place in 2011, when the Syrian uprising began and remained a peaceful uprising for 7 months until it was overwhelmed by violence, my assessment is that what broke the Syrian state was the behavior of Bashar al-Assad. It was his decision to use violence against his own citizens that created the market for other actors with guns, and that turned what was a peaceful uprising into a civil war. So again, I think we need to reckon with the roots of this disorder. So decentralization of power, devolution of power is already a fact in Syria. It's a fact, even in territory that's under regime control. And I think without attention to the exclusion, the state capture that produced the pressures for change in 2011, and without attention to the state coercion and the state violence that generated the civil war and created the space for extremists like ISIS in Syria, we're not going to see an end to this problem of jihadi violence, and we're not going to see an end to conflict in Syria and all of the attendant international security problems. So the Russian government now seems more actively interested in arriving at a diplomatic settlement, but I don't think it's possible to engineer such a settlement unless it is far more inclusive than the Astana process. Without real inclusion, without a political settlement that's truly inclusive, the war is not going to end. It's that simple. Sorry, I just lost my place here. So Look, the key point is this. It's a messy region. It is not fun to think about what it's going to take to put these pieces back together, not in a way that's perfect, but in a way that is sustainable. Sustainable ideally for the people of the region, but certainly for all of us who have a stake in regional stability. And I think the sooner we can get beyond the rhetoric about easy solutions, strongmen leaders who can somehow control this incredible dynamism, or military solutions to terrorism, the sooner we can start to do the hard work and build the trust necessary to make the real investment to put the Middle East back together. Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Wittes. Last but not least, we invite Dr. Mark Lynch to share his analysis on these contentious issues. As you can see, with all the populating of questions, we have quite a discussion coming up. Dr. Lynch is the professor of political science at the Elliott School of International Affairs at George Washington University. He's also the director of the Project on Middle East Political Science. So I'll give the floor over to you.
All right, thank you. And since the other three excellent presentations have already covered a lot of ground, I'll try and be brief and probably fail. I think it's absolutely fascinating that Irina describes the United States as a revisionist power in the Middle East, and Tamara describes the United States as a status quo power in the Middle East. And this, I think, very nicely encapsulates the difference. I would actually split the difference. And I would say that the US was a status quo power from 1991 until 2003, and in that period it built a stable and robust regional order which depended very heavily and in a self-reinforcing way, a position of US hegemony in which the United States became the central node in every meaningful type of international and regional interaction. All roads ran through Washington. But in 2003, the United States became a revisionist actor in the Middle East with the invasion of Iraq, which fundamentally transformed the regional balance of power and brought the United States into the Middle East in a highly revisionist way, dramatically increasing its direct military presence in the region, unleashing jihadist forces which had not previously existed in the forms of insurgencies as opposed to decentralized terrorist groups, and unleashing a whole series of effects which followed: the empowering of Iran, the spread and diffusion and transformation of jihadism, and I would say, playing a key role in the declining US willingness and ability to play the role of the provision of public goods. The American public lost patience with the endless costs of Iraq. It led to some, in my opinion, not enough, but some questioning about the purpose of the United States in the Middle East and its ability to solve problems with the military force. It fundamentally transformed the United States from a revisionist power, from a status quo power into a revisionist power. 2011, I would see as a follow-on in which the uprisings from below more or less fundamentally shattered regional order in the Middle East. The United States was not in a position to put those pieces back together, but that was in no small part because of its already having lost its hegemonic position. In my view right now, there is no regional order in the Middle East. There is no clear sense of the actual balance of power. There is no agreement on regional norms or regional leadership. And the United States is no longer a unipolar power in the Middle East. I think that its loss of a stable alliance system has created the opportunities which all three of the previous speakers identified. Russia, of course, has taken advantage of that, and I'll talk about that in a moment, but so have others. China, I think, is something which has not come up, I believe, once, at most once in this discussion. I think China is a much more serious long-term strategic challenger in the Middle East than Russia is, in terms of its energy interests and in terms of the inevitable, in my view, as an old-school realist, I suppose. This is what great powers do. They find the ways to defend their the natural resource needs, and I think China will do that in ways that Russia does not depend on the Middle East and for its energy, and I think has actually fewer long-term potentials for being a regional hegemon. Where I'd like to push back a little bit is I think that there seems to be a general sense that pervades this discussion that Russia has become a central player in Middle East politics, has been on the march and has become a genuine challenger to the United States. Now, I do think that the United States is genuinely challenged and actually has lost its ability, both in the Obama administration and the Trump administration, to determine or control outcomes. But I don't think Russia is a particularly strong challenger to the United States. I think that its record of advancement in the Middle East is highly exaggerated and profoundly overrated. There's certainly a perception among Middle Eastern elites that Russia matters more. And there's certainly in the American media, I would say, an obsessive inflation of Russia's success in the Middle East. But take a step back, and what has Russia actually accomplished in the Middle East over the last 6 years? It's gone from having one stable, powerful ally in the region, Syria, to having half of an ally, a Syrian regime which, as Tamara said, doesn't control its own territory, and which can only survive through the direct introduction and in my view, basically permanent military presence inside of Syria at high cost to no particular strategic advantage. It now has half of an ally instead of one ally. What has it gained beyond that? Well, it certainly has sold some weapons to the Gulf, and it's welcome in Middle Eastern capitals, but it hasn't formed any new alliances, and it hasn't intervened in any successful way in any other theater beyond Syria. In Yemen, it has done nothing. In Libya, all it has done is support Haftar, who is also supported by Egypt and the United Arab Emirates, and is in no sense Moscow's man in Libya, as these kind of ridiculous articles in the media portray him to be. They have taken advantage of the splintering of the Gulf Cooperation Council, but that is a self-inflicted wound by Saudi Arabia, not something which Russia began or is in any position to benefit from. Russia is certainly a more aggressive, present, and active diplomatic player in the Middle East today, but it has accomplished virtually nothing, and it actually, in my view, is probably weaker than it was in 2010, with one exception, and that is that, and this gets very much to what Tamara said about its absence of a vision for what regional order might look like. I think that, going back to the first panel of the day, I think that Russia has proven that it is very comfortable playing in the gray zones. In other words, it does not necessarily, and here I think I'm very curious to hear your take on this, Irina. I don't think it wants to restore stability or order in the Middle East. I think it benefits from the chaos. The more that the American-backed regional order breaks down, the more opportunities there are to opportunistically advance its interests. And I think that, in fact, it is not necessarily a kind of a race between two competing order-building projects, but rather a United States clearly losing and failing in its ability to recreate regional order, and Russia and many other actors benefiting from the failure of that order. Now, just in the 30 seconds I have left, I would say that I would disagree somewhat with the idea that the Trump administration has no idea what it's doing. I actually think its strategic vision for the Middle East is quite clear. It agrees with Saudi Arabia and Israel that the focus should be containment and rollback of Iranian influence. It has no interest in democracy, and it wants to focus on confronting Islamist movements and confronting Iran. And that vision is shared by the leadership of Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, President al-Sisi in Egypt, and the leadership of Israel. It wants to build a regional order around that axis, and that basically is what it wants to achieve. It hasn't changed its position in Syria or in Iraq. It's basically doing exactly what Obama did there. Hasn't really done much in North Africa. It hasn't really done much in Libya, because those don't matter to the areas that it cares about. Now, what that means for this discussion going forward is, what does Russia do in that environment? It has no problem with ignoring democracy. It has no problem with confronting Islamist movements. It has no problem with perpetuating the status quo in Syria, and it has no role in most of those other conflicts. The one area where this could all come crashing down, and you hinted at this at the end of your talk, and this is what I'll end with, is what happens if the confrontation with Iran goes from a Cold War to a hot war, or if the confrontation intensifies. What position would Russia play? Would it be an accelerant, or would it try and act as a brake on that kind of conflict. And that I'd be very curious to hear what you and the other Russians in this conference have to say about that. Thanks.
Amazing. Thank you guys so much for all your remarks. So as you can see, we have over 11 questions on the board. So we'll try to address as many as we can, but I'd like to give the first question to Professor Salman Khan. Yes, please wait for the mic to come around so that we can hear you. There.
Hi, I'm Salman Khan, and I teach international history here. And it's just the elephant in the room that no one's spoken about. You've talked a lot about what Russia and the United States want in the Middle East, but some of the sources of instability there predate 9/11, predate the Cold War, predate empires, really. So the hypothetical question is, even if you could somehow magic up a perfect Russia-US vision for how to maintain stability in the Middle East, does it really have a snowflake's chance in hell of succeeding?
Any one of you can take that.
Well, look, it's always a question worth asking, and I commend it. I emphasize the internal drivers of change. Mm-hmm. And so I think any successful external strategy has to build on those internal realities. That is extraordinarily difficult to do when regional governments themselves are working so hard not to grapple with those internal realities. So I don't think that the United States and Russia, even if we could come to a glorious vision of a new stable Middle East together, could impose such a vision on the region. I don't think any of the regional powers can successfully impose a vision. I think that the process of transformation is going to be long and painful, but I think that external actors can create incentives. And I think the power of incentives to help catalyze transformation over time is actually something that the United States and its partners have demonstrated in the world. I still believe that's possible.
Anyone else? Professor
Yeah, no, I mean, I would agree with that. I mean, the first thing is they have to come to an agreement about what the end game is and what it is. And I think at a minimum, it is stability, although I think Mark and Tammy made the right point that instability actually has favored, in particular, the Russian Federation's view at this point, because it could sort of stymie Western and US efforts and what it was trying to achieve in the Middle East. And I agree, if you look at when the Soviet Union collapsed, a lot of pressure was used, diplomatic and trade pressure, to get some of the post-Soviet states and also the East European states to sort of have democratic governance or more accountable, let's just say more accountable governance. So there are mechanisms that we can use, but I think one thing we will take away, and hopefully both the United States eventually learns this, but also the Russian Federation, is just how difficult it is to change internal governments. The United States, I was just doing a study, we've intervened since 1798, use of force 392 times. Since 2000, 188 of those account for since 2000. Very few of them are successful. And here we are again. And similarly, I haven't done the same count. I wonder if anybody has looked at Russian interventions historically and globally. But it's extraordinarily difficult to change the domestic politics in other states. It can be done from the outside, but only after there's agreement within the state, then agreement across coalitions that this is what needs to happen. And then a different path, and Mark sort of raised it, is that there's an external threat common to all. And that, I think, China might be it, where the United States and Russia look at each other and say, you know what, this is an even bigger threat. We need to ally interests because we don't want this sort of another global hegemon, or have it be too large that it's pushing around its weight a little bit too much against our interests.
Great. So
may I also say something? Because, you know, I wonder, we just keep discussing the governments. The governments can be changed. You cannot change the societies. Mm-hmm. And this is the core issues. You know, you can speak about democracy. You can speak about transformation. It's good things. Well, accountable government, who is against it? But if you look at the societies in the Middle East, the majority of them are traditional. and they don't know what freedom is. They don't know what democracy is. What they really want they want justice. But they can understand it in different ways, you know? And that is why jihadis, by the way, has so strong influence sometimes in the society. So this should be taken into consideration first.
Thank you. So we'll go ahead and take our first question, which received 13 votes, which is, please comment on Russia's internal threat of radical Islam and how it affects its security policy. So, would you like to take that one?
Excuse me, Russian security?
So Russia's internal threat of radical
threat.
Islam.
Yes, okay. So I wouldn't deny that such internal threat does exist, because we have 14 million Muslims only in Russia, and at the same time we don't have real borders with Central Asia, so we might have jihadis coming from Central Asia as well, or radicals coming from Central Asia. What's more, some Central Asia migrants in Russia are radicalized just in Russia, and then they come back to Central Asia because, you know, they live in very close societies. They're isolated from Russian society, and they don't have links with the societies of their own. So this is a problem. This is a problem, and it does exist. And we do know that there are from 3,000 to 7,000, nobody knows the exact numbers, of people from Russia fighting within the ranks of ISIS and probably other terrorist organizations. But this is not the problem of return. You know, sometimes we are being said that, well, this will be a real tragedy when all these foreign fighters, or they were native fighters, they will come back. And what will happen? They won't come back. It's not so difficult to trace down who left and who would come back. It's not a problem. Real problem is that of indoctrination, of radicalization, because really no one knows how to deal with it properly. Because this is the issue not of you or of us. This is the issue of the whole Muslim community first. And that is why we cannot do much about it.
Let me add on to that question and say, you know, what about radical ideologies that are brewing within the United States and some of the attacks we've seen within our country and the efforts from a policymaking perspective to kind of limit, at least through immigration, just what would you say are some of the threats within the United States?
Well, maybe I'll pick up on Irina's last point. I think the foreign fighter challenge, it presents differently for different countries. Certain countries, there are a lot of potential returnees. And it presents a challenge just in terms of capacity to track. But I agree that the larger issue is the radicalization issue. And this is not something on which social science has developed a clear understanding. It's certainly not something on which governments have developed a set of wildly effective responses. And I think it is undoubtedly context dependent and different country to country and maybe even within countries in different regions and different circumstances. But it may be an area of potential greater cooperation, given that in different ways we are all facing the challenge of radicalization. I do want to say, just in response to the way you framed your question, I don't see this as a problem of immigration. I think we've seen radicalization in enough different contexts of people coming from enough different backgrounds, some newly arrived, some who've been in country for years, some who were born and raised here. So I don't really think it's about immigration. I think it's about psychology, and that makes it a lot harder.
Yeah, I guess I was thinking more along the lines of a policy reaction that the Trump administration has taken. So I'll kind of combine the next two questions and add that, you know, much of the U.S.-Russian relationship has been defined by proxy wars. We saw this in the Cold War in East Asia, and we're seeing it again in the Middle East. And it appears that, you know, as some of you guys have mentioned, that there's larger geopolitical conflicts, interests there. But what is it specifically about the Middle East? You know, somebody posed it as, you know, it seems that we're treating symptoms rather than the disease. Like, would you characterize that there is that the Middle East is plagued by a disease? What makes it such a fertile soil for conflict and external intervention?
Well, I mean, I think it's the strategic game. I mean, there are resources there, there are interests, there's histories there. So I think that's still playing out, and there's vital interests. I mean, this is why China's moving into the region. So I think that's out. And then I think Tammy raised it, but also Mark and Irina to some extent. Some people could argue that we're in the fourth wave of democratization, and I use that term democratization in quotes, meaning that you have civil society, citizens saying we don't want to live under autocratic rules anymore. I mean, this is the Arab Spring. There was a Catholic wave and an East Orthodox wave, and now we're in maybe a Muslim wave. And the question is another decade, another 2 decades, will they succeed? So I think there is so much turmoil. Some of it is coming from the outside. I mean, the United States did upset the apple cart by going into Iraq in 2004. And then the consequences spilled out. And then with the Arab Spring, those were populations saying, we want accountable, transparent, and not necessarily democratic, but governments that are responsive to us, that can actually provide for our basic needs, that children can get married if they choose to. There were real sociological changes that happened for the 80s and the 90s, and the Arab governments in particular were not in a position to be able to deal with that. And I agree with Assad. He could have handled the demonstrations so much better, but instead he decided to shoot on his own people, and that's what led to the civil war. It was a real tragedy, because that was a place where you saw a fork in the road, and man, he took the wrong one.
Well, from his perspective, he may have taken the right one.
Yeah.
Because,
he's still alive.
Right, because if regime security is your priority and you're willing to pay any price.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, for him it was a mutiny, It was a real challenge, and he handled it just as in the way it is always handled in Syria and in other places. So there's no wonder, actually. We know why.
No, I would say it's no wonder. I would also say it is not going to succeed in the longer term. And it's a Pyrrhic victory, because what is it that he's ruling over? So, I think the notion that the rest of us should simply acquiesce in this outcome because, well, what else did we expect him to do? Again, is failure to grapple with what generated the instability in the first place. Those forces haven't gone anywhere. Okay, the youth demographics of this region haven't gone anywhere. The failure of these clientelistic systems has not changed. The inability of these states to grapple with the global economy has not changed. So there has to be a different model developed for this region, for these people. They're going to have to come to themselves. But the idea that, well, Assad found an answer that worked. No, I disagree. It's not a workable answer.
It worked for him only.
It's tactically.
And for his regime, it worked for some time.
But the idea that we should all accede to that, I'm afraid I'm not comfortable with it, because first of all, because it's morally repugnant. But secondly, because it is historically inviable. It is short-sighted. It is not sustainable. And so if what we care about is lasting stability in this region, no, it's not going to work. It's not going to work.
But one of the issues, when people say that they have to do these, I always wonder if that's an imperative statement or an empirical statement. They probably should, but I see no evidence that they will, or that they have the capacity to do it, even if they come up with an idea for it. I think the fundamental issue, and it gets to your question about why the proxy wars take place. I think that the region really is experiencing a fundamental collapse of the state. And I think that you have at least 5 completely failed states in the Middle East right now, and the rest of them are consolidating power in ways, and I agree with Tamara on this, in ways that increase their instability over the long term. But very few politicians care about the long term. They care about surviving tomorrow. And ideally, they might think about next week. And so I just see very little evidence that there are any leaders in the Middle East who are thinking about how can we have long-term stability, or in Washington or Moscow for that matter. I think that what we're seeing is the complete absence of policy instruments from the outside to control or shape anything in the region, and more or less the abdication of long-term thinking by most of the leaders of the region as they frantically try and survive. And I think that that helps to explain, I think, why we're seeing so much turbulence and failure, policy failure.
Yeah, I'd just like to add, in 2004, I was part of a conference, and there were a bunch of people there from public policy school in the Middle East. And I study demography and longer-term trends, and I'm writing a book on the collapse of states by demographic factors. And I said, what are you guys going to do about this? You've got this youthful population. The states are not, they don't have the capacity to deal with this. So you know what? We're just going to bide our time. And here we are. And I don't want to say it was all demographics that led to the revolutions, but there were some serious strains that you could track over the longer term. And by the way, the Mideast states are not alone. The United States, we're dealing with a rise of nativism and racism in this country, and it's because we're seeing a change in the diversity and the multicultural nature of our country, and some people are very uncomfortable with that. And so how is American policymaker? Similarly in Russia, although Russia's doing great on the fertility front. You've had some recovery.
Yes, go ahead.
If I may add a couple of words to it, because I do agree that there is fragility of regime, that there is a fragility of the states. There are no real nation states in the region. But at the same time, I would like to draw our attention to the fact that there are still very stable regimes. Yes, we are talking about certain states where we have civil wars or which really went into pieces and so on and so forth. But if you take first the monarchic regimes in the Middle East, they're legitimate and they're pretty stable. If you even take two regimes which survived the Arab Spring, like Tunisian and the Egyptian regime, which was simply restored, probably in a more violent form than it existed under Mubarak, we see that some regimes still manage to survive. And this is also a very interesting issue for us. How come that they managed to survive in this transitional period which Middle East is living through?
Well, I'm reminded of Mao, the apocryphal story about Mao and Kissinger and the French Revolution. It's too soon to tell. And I would certainly apply that to the restoration of the regime in Egypt. Jordan, Morocco survived through very fast, very significant reforms. Still may be insufficient, but very significant attempts to address the forces that Monica was describing and the demands. Tunisia did have a regime change. And as for the monarchical regimes, I think if the Saudi regime felt that it were sitting pretty, it would not right now be engaged in a very ambitious and very risky project of domestic political and economic reform. And as for the small emirates, it would be nice to be able to have that kind of economic and demographic balance, but we can't all be Singapore, right?
So we're hitting up on time, but I do want to pose one final question and one final, maybe one or two remarks very briefly. Dr. Lynch, you rightfully brought up China, which is another superpower that hasn't really come up in conversation. We have a question from Rachel saying that China's expressed interest in helping rebuild Syria, at least in the context of the Belt and Road Initiative. Can US, Russia, and China work together in the context of improving stability? So in other words, can the economic improvement in building of infrastructure or providing resources, if that is at the core of some of the conflicts?
I think China would be very happy to make money off of that, and has zero interest in taking part in the politics of it. And I think that's true across the board, which from their perspective is an extremely smart place to be. They've been free riding on superpower competition in the Middle East for 50 years. Why stop now? At the same time, they are steadily and aggressively building their infrastructural investments and expanding their reach and their influence. I don't know that they can continue to avoid playing a political role, but I think they will do so as long as they can.
Great. Any other? Great. Well, thank you so much, you guys. Now we'll have lunch.